So, one day on Monday, my friend Stacia came to work with this weird story. She was visiting from California and had been out looking for a weekend adventure away from boring Warner Robins. And she'd gone way out into the country and found this creepy, old, abandoned asylum. You could walk right up to it, poke around in the broken windows, explore. She said it was called Central State Hospital in Milledgeville. And it was once the largest psychiatric hospital in the world. So when my sisters and I decided we wanted a spooky sister weekend, we went looking for it. And it turned out there was a trolley tour of the hospital that was scheduled on my birthday, so it was fate. This is the story of how we met a photographer named Jessica, talked our way behind the locked gates of Central State, and discovered a whole lot about the state of mental health in Georgia. This is Lost Places and Faces, a podcast for people who like to peek through fences. I'm your host, Briarly Davis, and I'm unlocking those gates to search dark, musty hallways looking for the memories lingering in forgotten spaces. These places can be dangerous. The scariest things are often the real live people inside. So don't try this yourself. And fun fact, it's still breaking and entering if the hole is already in the fence. It was originally called Georgia's Lunatic, Idiot, and Epileptic Asylum. Massive brick buildings surround three sides of a large pecan grove that kind of reminds me of Gone with the Wind. Now, it's like a whole ghost city. Milledgeville used to be the capital of Georgia, and the campus kind of reminds me of Washington, D.C. with a big Capitol Square. At the end of the grove, there's this big white building that looks a lot like Congress.
When people ask me about what's something that just really stands out to me, it has to be the absolute sheer size of these buildings. They are massive. And to imagine those buildings being filled with patients and then understanding that they were short-staffed, there was overcrowding. They didn't always have the resources that they needed to care for the patients in a way that those who work there would have liked to have. It's just overwhelming to me to think about these monstrous buildings being overcrowded. That is a lot of people.
That's my friend Jessica. We'll meet her in a minute. This place is surrounded by fences. The buildings are just crumbling away inside. The fence, when we first saw it, was like a challenge. It was taunting us to come inside. So after the trolley tour, the ladies at the visitor center told me that if I wanted to learn more about Central State, there was a photographer across the street that was full of stories. We met Jessica down the end of a long hallway full of photos of peeling green paint, sideways burnt out hallways, and brick buildings peeking through razor wire. And she introduced us to the legend.
Living in Milledgeville for as long as I have, there's not very many people, even college students who come here brand new. If you go over to Georgia College and State University and grab a couple of college students and ask them if they've heard of Central State Hospital, they will tell you yes. Yes, that's where, they sent the crazy people, or it's haunted. And you'll always hear them talk about how they have a friend, or even they went into one of the abandoned buildings and it was spooky, and it almost seems like it's part of the college experience here in Milledgeville.
When I talked to people in Georgia about the hospital, I heard the same things. My friend John, he's really old, told me that when he was little, his mom would say, "If you don't behave, I'll ship you down to Milledgeville." One other local told me that when she was young and the hospital was thriving, they'd drive through the campus and hear people howling out of the windows. The stores there have t-shirts with the slogan, "Keep Milledgeville Crazy." So, a little confession. This isn't our first asylum. One of my sisters is a mental health counselor, and the other started her life as an archaeologist. So we're into weird, old, spooky science. And Jessica has spent her whole career dedicated to mental health care, and now she works in the justice system as an assistant to a judge in Milledgeville. So we really hit it off. We wanted to know about how she started photographing the hospital and how she managed to get inside. So she told me she was first inspired by a psychology professor at Georgia State College who had worked at the hospital. His mentorship made a huge impact on her life, and it devastated her when he passed away. They had talked about taking students out on a walking tour of the campus, tell some spooky stories for Halloween and teach them about the hospital, but they never had a chance to do it. That inspired her to go explore the campus herself.
I went out to the campus with a camera that I bought for $185 on Facebook Marketplace and started taking pictures. And I found that it was very therapeutic for me. And people gave me some, good comments. They were like, oh, these, are really great. I had never really picked up a camera too much before outside of your normal friends and family pictures.
Her photography was beautiful, eerie, and thought-provoking with these vivid otherworldly colors and sharp, uncomfortable angles. When I first saw it, I was immediately captured by this one photograph of this hallway. And when you look at the hallway, it's slanted sideways on the diagonal. And you're looking down the hallway through a series of doors that are kind of broken open. And it's smoky, and there's evidence of a fire. It looks like it's this burnt out building. And it's really uncomfortable to look at. And that's why she says it's interesting. She told us that she found her passion in the art exhibit because it helps her start conversations about uncomfortable things.
Well, first I think it gets them thinking about Central State, and then they ask questions about Central State. There are a lot of rumors, there are a lot of horror stories, because we're fascinated by those things as human beings. So when I can get people to have a conversation because they look at this particular picture, which I took beside a little roadway beside the Rivers Complex, which was the tuberculosis ward for Central State Hospital, and then became a prison in the 80s. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful roadway. But then you see the chain link fence and the razor wire beside it. It's that contrast, the beauty, and then, the razor wire, which is, of course, terrifying to most of us. None of us, want to be in a situation where we're behind a fence with razor wire. So I think just getting to tell those stories of the pictures always gives me an opportunity to tell the story of mental health.
In these photos, she found a mission to teach people about the true story of Central State on the other side of her lens. The coolest thing about Jessica's exhibit, though, was that it unlocked the doors for us and allowed us to peek inside. She had hundreds of photos of the inside of the hospital, and we were instantly curious. Like, how do you gain access to these abandoned buildings? There's fences up everywhere, and they spend half the trolley tour telling you not to go inside. It's just too dangerous. So it turns out you make friends with Jessica and her Scooby-Doo crew, Matt and Sarah. They've been inside Central State dozens of times. Jessica's the photographer, Matt is the security, and well, they say Sarah provides the comic relief.
I've been friends with Matt and Sarah for countless years, and I adore them. And Matt is like the great protector. At one time, I had kind of walked ahead. Matt and Sarah were lagging behind a bit, and they were like around a corner, so I couldn't see them, but I could kind of hear them. And that's not something that we really did. We stayed together, for safety's sake. I mean, it's dark and, there could be people or whatever. He came running so fast, and Sarah came a few minutes later, and she was like, my husband just left because you yelled for him, and I think that's so wrong. And he was like, but if Jessica needs us, we have to be here. And that's so true to our friendship, the three of us, because we really did have to protect each other in those spaces.
We asked how to get in on that action. I asked Matt and Sarah how they got to be part of the Scooby-Doo crew.
And that's why, we joke around that we're our employees that, get paid by getting a tag along.
Something I never thought I'd be able to do.
No, never. When I tell people I want to go.
You
take me with you. I'm like, no. Like, you have to pass a certain vibe check. Jessica's got to tap into your vibe before it's even a consideration.
Our 3-hour conversation about Central State passed the vibe. We had a lot in common. We're all into danger, adventure, and maybe a ghost or two.
The creepy factor is awesome. I love a good ghosty. I love a good creepy building. I love a good adventure.
So we went home after that trip and didn't hear anything from Jessica for months. Until one day, we got this text message, and we had already decided that it wasn't going to happen. My little sister had decided she was going to use her vacation time to come home for Thanksgiving, and we just forget about it. And then suddenly I got a text message from Jessica saying, "It's on. Do you want to come down for 3 days to go into the hospital at night?" I think my little sister booked a plane ticket in less than 5 minutes. And we were on. We were going to get to see those smoky, crumbly, peeling walls up close and personal. So before we head inside, there's some things you should know about Central State. Central State is huge. They had over 200 buildings and treated over 12,000 patients in their heyday. That's like a small city. It was completely self-sustaining.
The hospital affected thousands and thousands and thousands of people, whether they went there for treatment or whether they worked there or whether they had a family member that was there. The hospital opened in 1842. That's 180 years. Yeah, that's a long, long, long history.
And the buildings are a maze with never-ending hallways that wind in and out of stairwells and heavy locked metal doors. And it's really easy to get lost inside. We needed a guide. And they're dangerous. The hospital recently splashed across the headlines again this summer when Governor Kemp officially ruled that the old historical buildings could be torn down. The only 2 buildings that are going to remain on the Pecan Grove are that big white building that I told you about up at the top, the Capitol building. That's called the Powell building. And it was the original hospital building and the last to close in 2010. The other building that's going to remain is the Chapel of All Faiths, which they still use. I mean, theater groups have shows there all the time. And you can get married if you want to hang out with the ghosts. Governor Kemp said they're tearing them down because they're just collapsing from the inside. The ceilings and the floors are sagging away, and the brick walls are just crumbling inside, and a brick could fall and hit you in the head. That's why the fences are there. Those really old buildings at the front of the complex are inaccessible, and you should never try to go inside. We went to 3 sets of buildings owned by the Redevelopment Authority. We went to the Binion building, which used to be the Forensic Hospital. That's for the criminally insane. And then 2 sets of buildings that were converted to prisons before being closed down. One was the Frank Scott Prison, which was the old African American hospital at Central State. The other is Rivers Prison. It was a hospital that treated tuberculosis outbreaks that just devastated the hospital population. And so there are some rules. It's important for safety. We had to apply for permits and sign waivers. Before heading into those buildings, we met law enforcement on the property to let them know that we were there and that we had a police escort, thanks to Matt. That means that Matt goes first. That part was important because some of the scariest things in the hospital weren't the ghosts. It was the alive people. We had to be careful about safety, wear closed-toed shoes, and pay attention to our surroundings. And, most importantly,
don't do any damage, leave it how you found it.
The Spooky Doo crew took respect seriously, so remember to respect the building, because this used to be somebody's home. And that's it for the rules, so now, are you ready to go inside? They keep the doors doors chained to keep out vagrants and curious teens. When we go in, we'll chain the door shut behind us to make sure nobody sneaks in.
Matt, you got the chain?
Yeah.
So be prepared to be locked into the asylum with whatever is living or dead inside.
I've locked it.
Locked us. All right, no escape.
No escape.
Let's do it.
The first place we explored was the Binion building, you remember, for the criminally insane. But Binion was not really spooky, just dilapidated with peeling paint on the walls and birds starting out of the room to startle you.
But just to walk through a door and then just, it just, it'll make you see Jesus real quick.
That crunching you hear on the floor is crumbling paint, dust, and a lot of other debris piled up. As you walk through the levels, the patients graduated up the building in Independence.
They worked on a level system, and I only know that because we saw the level system is in a plexiglass thing in the hall. And so our assumption is, and the way that most programs are set up, as you level up, you get more freedom.
So the first floor is all open bays with these half walls forming cubes that would have had some cots and lockers inside. They kind of remind you of Orange is the New Black. The next floor has independent rooms lining the hall with bubble windows in the doors. You can stick your head inside the bubble and see all four sides of the room. It's kind of a low-tech surveillance before they had cameras. In between the buildings are these spooky courtyards with 70s-looking plastic bubble chairs and basketball courts where patients could see the sky but not the grass. But it was mostly modern. It looked like something you might have seen in the 90s if you went to a public high school. Concrete block walls, cafeterias where the seats are little stools attached to tables. It really wasn't closed that long ago. There were these cheerful murals with butterflies on the walls and colored doors. We felt pretty safe until we turned a corner down a hallway at the end of the building. And then this happened. Out of nowhere, a kitten came flying down the hallway and came straight at me, parkouring off the wall.
Then I hear the deathly howls of everybody, getting mauled and all that.
I mean, you think there'd have been a tiger in there the way we screamed, or a zombie or something like that, the way we were hysterical.
I thought it was a squirrel at first.
Right. I was like, what is
Right.
Let's swap because
You just pee your toes with this.
I thought, oh God, this is it. Oh God, this is it.
Yeah, they got me. They got me.
They got us. Oh God. Don't let it in here.
So, you know how I said that Matt always goes first? That's so that the rest of us can be in the middle. Jessica keeps the spooky ghosts of our back from the rear. But Sarah's always in the middle, and I felt like I agreed with her on that.
Which the middle is the worst place to be.
I don't care. I feel safer in the middle.
That's the worst.
I feel safer in the middle.
It feels safer in the middle.
It does. It
I definitely
does.
was always in the middle
Yeah,
when we were there.
absolutely.
I was like, I don't want to be at the back where the ghosts will get me.
Yeah,
And I want to
exactly.
be the front where like the scary people who are actually
Exactly.
alive might get me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm safe in the middle.
And then I was in the middle and the kitten got me, so it was clearly not safe.
No.
It parkoured off the wall right in front of me. We felt a little bit bad for the kitten.
I'm just glad I saw it first.
He said if he hadn't seen it first, he might have shot it. So maybe it's not as safe as we all thought. We didn't see any real danger, though, until we went to the Frank Scott prison later that night. We went to two other sets of buildings that were built in 1940 when the hospital expanded to try to fix major problems with overcrowding. They built a tuberculosis hospital and dormitories that were eventually converted into prisons in the 80s after the hospital started shutting down. The tuberculosis hospital became River State Prison, which we're going to visit tomorrow night, and the other one became Frank Scott Prison. At Frank Scott, there are three buildings: the Kemper Building, the Ingram Building, and the Holly Building. The names are printed on little prison guardhouses outside the fence. Frank Scott Prison looks like something out of Jurassic Park these days. Tall trees and vines loom over infinitely high chain link fences with razor wire on top. We had a key to the fence, but most of us just squeezed through a hole in the fence because the gate was blocked with a broken branch and razor wire.
What if that razor wire just fell down like in
final destination.
I was just about to say that's Final Destination damaging our entire generation.
Yeah.
The whole place was covered in razor wire, weaving in and out of broken and grown-up foliage.
Okay, so people have taken this razor wire and like stretched it, and it would just be in like, you see the glint right there?
Yeah.
That, okay, everybody knows
Watch
that
your
it
feet.
will fucking
Fuck you
gut
up.
you. Like, you'll barely touch it, and it'll be like,
Got it.
We had to be extremely careful and use bright flashlights to make our way to the building. We went to the Ingram building, which housed African American patients before segregation ended. Frank Scott looks more like a prison than a mental hospital these days. So when we entered Frank Scott, the first thing we saw was a short hallway with heavy metal doors on either side. This was the isolation ward for prisoners who were being punished. It was heavy from the moment we stepped into the building, and we didn't linger in this area for long. When the prisons closed, they basically just left the buildings. Everything is still inside, stacks of bunk beds collapsing in old dormitories. So in prisons, they stored all the tools and utensils in these cabinets and lockboxes, with the item shape sloppily painted like a shadow in the space where it would hang. So in the kitchen, there's still a few ice cream scoops hung on hooks over painted shadows of ice cream scoops, so that they could tell if inmates had returned the tools to where they were supposed to go. There are a lot of rooms like this with shadowed outlines of tools and scissors. We went up to the 4th floor to see a part of the building that was compelling to Jessica. Back when this was a hospital, the 4th floor would have been dormitories that housed the most violent and disturbed patients. They actually installed air conditioning in these buildings with a forced air system they believed would actually help treat their mental illness. A long time ago, someone set a fire on the 4th floor, and you can smell it as you walk up the stairs. It was summer, so the buildings were already hot, stuffy, and full of smells of dust and mold.
That's where it's all burned up.
yeah.
Do you really want to go up there, Ricky? It's kind of hard to breathe up there.
And as we walked up the stairs, the air got really heavy and it was really hard to breathe. And it just smelled black and sooty.
It smells like burnt.
The walls were covered in ash and soot blackened from the fire. Oh, watch out. There are pipes hanging down from the ceiling as we go into the next room. The place Jessica wanted to take us was a classroom. It was probably used for a substance abuse program or maybe GED classes while the prison was open. In the room, there are 5 rows of desks, perfectly aligned. It looks like the students should walk into the room at any time to start class.
That was just so weird because everything else was in complete disarray. And these desks are just perfectly centered, waiting on class.
Jessica has a really cool photo in her exhibit where you can see the desks all lined up in neat rows. When we got up there, we knew something was wrong. It didn't smell like old fire. It smelled like something new, like fresh fire, or maybe cigarette smoke.
There's not a fresh fire up here.
Yeah, I think
This
you're
is
right.
not the old fire.
I think you're right.
We were planning to continue through the building and go down the staircase at the other side of the room, but Matt stopped us.
Matt, are we going to go down on that side of the building?
Something didn't feel right.
I don't remember it being this burnt.
What did I say?
In this corner.
That's
Yeah.
what Jessica said. There's been a
Yeah,
fresh
there's
fire.
been a fire since we were here last. I think we should go back out the way that we came
Okay.
because I'm not feeling good about.
That way.
That's all I need to hear.
When Jessica says go, you go. We pretty much left immediately. As we walked out of the building back through the isolation ward, it felt like something was ushering us out of the building. As we walked out on the loading dock full of trees and bushes blocking open doors in the building just across the dock, it felt like something was watching us, that we weren't alone. We walked quickly, picking our way through razor wire and broken branches until we got back to the gate, 50 feet or more away from the building. It wasn't until we got to the gate that unsettling feeling suddenly went away. The Spooky Doo crew says that sometimes they feel like the buildings and previous occupants are sending them messages or vibes. We ended that night early because that was enough for all of us. When we looked back at the photos a few nights later, there was one picture down that hallway that Matt went to check out. In the photo, there were 2 white dots that look weirdly like white tennis shoes walking away. There's a shadow, it's not really identifiable, but we all think that there was someone inside with us, someone who might have been setting a fire.
That places are so big, you can walk in one door and somebody be walking out the next, and y'all don't even know you're there and think that it's, Casper, making noises. And it's really somebody else. And then there is evidence of people, squatting there and drinking and smoking and, just being
Idiots.
assholes.
They found living people in the buildings before.
Shit, that's what I was more scared of than any kind of ghost or specter or anything like
It's
that.
a living people.
Yeah.
Matt even had to draw his gun on someone. That was what we were most worried about and why we brought protection. And that's why Matt always goes first and clears all the rooms and dark, shadowy spaces before we go inside. If you hear something, you should let him know. We made some really cool discoveries while we were in the hospital, and some of the coolest things we found in Rivers, and it was also our best opportunity to discover more about the people who lived at Central State.
To me, Rivers is my home. I mean, I could just live there. You know? I mean, I really could. I would love to buy the whole thing and just...
You'd be living by yourself.
Well, I mean, that'd be fine.
The three buildings that make up Rivers North, South, and East were originally built in 1940 to solve a really big problem at Central State. They were called the Great Tuberculosis Hospital. They spent $1 million just on these three buildings so that they could separate tuberculosis patients from the rest of the hospital population and treat them in isolation. Before they built Rivers, one hospital report said that they housed white male patients with tuberculosis in what could only generously be called a shack. African American patients were left with a general population where they could spread tuberculosis indiscriminately. The buildings are named after Governor Rivers, who led the fight for the hospital improvements. He originally asked for $8 million to solve overcrowding in the hospital. They planned to use part of it to build dormitories and part for the new tuberculosis hospital. They didn't even get half of what they asked for. Tuberculosis was a deadly disease that most people didn't recover from. It's a lung disease. If you look up at Rivers Hospital, there's these T's on the building. It's actually a T with two lines through the middle. Most people see that and they think that it's because it was a tuberculosis hospital, but that's only partially true. That's the symbol of the American Lung Association, which was founded around the turn of the century to try to solve the scourge of tuberculosis. It had 3 wings, each could house 210 patients, and it was divided up among white male patients, white female patients, and African American patients. There were tunnels underneath all the buildings that allowed doctors and food service workers to travel between the buildings in all weather. We have a really cool picture of us in the tunnels you can check out with the show notes. The building was designed with the open air concept of treatment that meant that patients needed as much fresh air as possible to get better. So the original building had 12 porches that patients could be set up in to get fresh air into their lungs. And there was this extra 4th floor with a sun porch on half of it. The rest of the buildings in Rivers only have 3 floors. So this half 4th floor is kind of a sneaky mystery that you don't really notice from the outside. And Jessica and the Spooky Doo crew found it by accident.
Well, it just kind of came up out of nowhere. Because we had been through those buildings several times. But again, they're so massive. I mean, you can go through it 100 times, I'm sure, and still discover some new room or new something. And when we discovered it, I mean, it was kind of like a time capsule.
That half 4th floor is really cool. The 4th floor of Rivers East is the surgical floor, complete with state-of-the-art operating rooms.
Anytime that we are there and we discover something new, of course, we all research it. And so to see that they perform surgery like in open air suite so that the natural light could come in was just wild to us. So it's such a history lesson to see and to experience that.
They have these big 3-pane windows that open up to let fresh air and light in so that the surgeons could do their best work.
When we think of surgical suites now, they're so closed and sterile. And so when you're standing in the suite up there, and I'm sure that there weren't trees growing up, it's not been well kept. So there's now trees outside of the surgical suite window. But I mean, you know, a bird could fly in.
The surgery has green tile, you know, mental health green. And when you walk through, you find a little room in the back for doctors to scrub in. There's a big sink still in there. And in one of the walls, there's a large stainless steel autoclave that looks brand new. Autoclaves were these big kind of ovens that could be used to sterilize operating tools and other things to make surgery safer. I think they're kind of like a really hot dishwasher. It looks like a bank vault in the wall with a big circular handle on the front that you turn to open the autoclave, and it's covered in glass valves that measure the temperature and pressure. It's a really cool piece of history. It looks like they could do surgery right now. We wandered all over the surgical floor and found an x-ray wall with a little glass window. There were laundry chutes that went all the the way down to the basement that you could poke your head into and try to see the bottom. One floor down, we spent a while in a dormitory thinking about the people who would have lived there. It's this big open room with lots of windows to let in light. It was storming that night, so the windows let in this fresh, cool air that we hadn't felt anywhere else in the hospital because it was so oppressive with the heat. We were optimistic, thinking about the hospital staff, doctors, nurses, and attendants that took care of patients here. When they built this hospital, they had hoped to provide better care.
There's negative stigma to Central State anyway, thinking this is just some torture area. And I did at one point until Jessica pointed it out, they did what they were...
The best they knew how to do.
Yeah, now we know that...
Lobotomies aren't cool.
Aren't fun and, but...
Back then they thought that was state-of-the-art treatment.
Yeah.
And, it was a cutting-edge hospital. The patients were getting cutting-edge treatment.
Matt and Sarah said that they had this particular experience that helped them relate to the tuberculosis patients.
And I think some of it might even have to do with us having COVID.
When we had COVID, we had it really bad. It was during the Delta variant, and I actually ended up in ICU for 9 days. And he was at home. Probably should have been in the hospital, too.
Matt had COVID really bad, so much so that one night he thought he might not make it.
When I still had the COVID part, and I was just trying to breathe, I remember sitting on my couch, holding my pillow, because I knew something told me if I laid down, I wasn't going to make it. I remember holding my pillow, going, I'm not going to be able to be the police anymore. I can't even put my uniform on. I can't walk to the damn door, and, I don't know what the fuck I'm going to do.
Matt had an uncle back in his family who had tuberculosis. He researched the treatments that included lung resections. That's where they cut out pieces of your lungs to make it easier to breathe. And he said that when he was in the surgery in the hospital, that he thought of his uncle and his own experience with struggling with COVID.
But to walk in there and it just be a breath of fresh air, in a hospital where you can't breathe, and that's why you're there. But you just have this, oh my God.
He said that he could relate to the stigma, the feeling of needing to be separated and isolated from everyone else because of the terrible disease.
All right, you got to separate people with tuberculosis, with this illness, to preserve the safety and the health of others.
Like COVID.
Like COVID. It's kind of like, and I knew what it's like to not be able to breathe.
Mm-hmm.
Tuberculosis patients were nearly always sent to sanitariums like Central State to be isolated from everyone else. But it was a place to go and be treated and actually have a chance at survival.
And I think it goes back to the COVID, this excitement of having somewhere to get people help and stop this spread of
tuberculosis,
this virus.
Yeah.
And people came in and never came out. It's just like the nurses told you when you got released.
That's exactly what I was just thinking about. When I was in the elevator being released, the nurse said, you're very fortunate because you're getting to do what a lot of people haven't been able to do. And I just started crying.
Mm-hmm.
He realized that if times were different, it might have been him here.
There's a lot of bad stigma of it too. And there's a lot of bad stigma with COVID. Oh, it doesn't exist. It's, all in your mind, or, oh, this is going to kill
it's just
everybody.
A cold.
Or it's going to kill everybody. We got to get everybody separated. And, things hadn't improved in the medical field. Would we have been taken somewhere like that?
Now he has a different perspective. He says that when a lot of people think of Central State, they think it's just a place full of crazy people. But Matt thinks of it as a home, a place for people who didn't have anywhere to go. And when he goes into those spaces, he feels calm because it was meant to be a good place.
Yeah, and I remember seeing a picture of it being built and thinking, this is going to be somebody's home.
He worries about the memories left behind by all these people who lived and died there.
It's kind of one of my concerns, these spirits that are there, and you can feel them and you can hear them. If they tear it down,
where are they going to go?
Where are they going to go? That's their home.
While we were in the dormitory thinking about these people, we decided to play some music. When we did that, it completely changed the atmosphere in the building. It felt like it was coming alive. Like it wasn't this abandoned, decrepit building anymore.
Yeah, it did give it such a different feel. It was joyful, and I like to think that when we experienced that together, that we connected with that space in a way that was joyful. And I don't think, all of the halls always saw a lot of joy. So, yeah, that was a great experience.
It seemed like the patients could walk in at any moment. It took away all the stress and danger of the last couple of nights and left us feeling relieved and refreshed, which was the whole reason they built these buildings in the first place.
The building lives. There's breath in that building.
There's still life in it.
Yeah.
Even though it's abandoned, there's still so much life there, I think.
And I mean, that was one of the happiest moments that I've felt there.
That was the end of our tour, and as the building lit up and we played our music, I was drawn back to the contrast that Jessica talked about in her artwork. Rivers is one of Jessica's favorite buildings to photograph. She has a picture of the outside of Rivers hanging in the conference room outside of her office. And you remember how I said that Matt's favorite building is Rivers? Well, this is his favorite photograph.
She's got the picture of the crosses, the
American Lung Association.
American Lung Association crosses that are built into brick at Rivers. And there's one, all the ivy in kudzu is bright and green. And then as the seasons change, she took it and it's just all dead. And it's like life cycles through. And it's not, the building isn't dead. The building's, she's showing that there's life to this place. And everything has a story to tell.
He says that her photographs bring the hospital back to life for him and offer a place for the patients to speak again.
With Jessica being able to put a voice through pictures, it's just unreal.
In the last chapter, we'll explore these voices and consider what happened to the thousands of patients that were living behind these high brick walls. Jessica said that when she decided to make an exhibit, she knew immediately what it would be called. Seeking Asylum. She said each word has a special meaning that speaks to her mission.
So seeking is obviously searching out, attempting to find something. Seeking is a very purposeful action. It's something that you want to do or you are compelled to do. And the word asylum means, in the way that I use it, it is a safe place. It is almost like a place of rest or a place of solace.
When your world isn't right, you look for that.
Suffering from mental illness, that is what they do. I mean, you're seeking that peace, you're seeking that safety, and that's a big, huge deal. In my own struggles with depression and anxiety, I can say that it's a constant mission to seek that safety, to be able to really look for peace, which is really hard to find sometimes. I mean, it's a tough world.
Her exhibit is a place of solace, but also a place to reflect. So let's head back there to explore her art and think about what it's really telling us. Now that we've seen the hospital, we have a better idea of the kinds of stories that Jessica captures in her art.
I think that my photos are emotional. I'm not just trying to capture like the space. I'm not just taking a picture of like a doorway or a wall. I want to capture the emotion of that space. I think that's what makes it different.
When she walks around the hospital, she thinks of the people who lived inside and the way that they spent their lives there.
I'm struck by just how massive the hospital was, but then there's these thousands of individual, intimate stories. And so that's something that I try to capture.
There was over 100 years of history in those buildings as they grew and decayed and changed and were reborn.
There was sorrow there. There was misery there. Anyone that suffers from a severe mental illness can tell you there is suffering. But there are also stories of hope. And so those contrasts and then the decay of the buildings, but then there's the beauty also that I can capture in the photographs. So it's really just the contrast and how stark that contrast can be. And that is sometimes what living with a mental illness is like.
The hospital evolved over time, and when one building crumbled, they just built a new one. And when they didn't need it to be a hospital anymore, they turned it into something else, like a prison, a school, or a chapel for plays to be performed in.
Throughout the years, as buildings were no longer needed or downsizing happened, they would then use the buildings for other programs. That's one of the things that I find interesting is just the evolution of what the different buildings were used for over time as the needs changed.
And ultimately, her story is about the patients. She says it's kind of awe-inspiring, the things that they've read about and the patients that they've heard about, and that they stood here and they lived in this space and they made memories in this space and they died in this space. And that's really powerful. And she wants to capture those kinds of feelings that make us uncomfortable, that make mental health issues still stigmatized even today.
I think that is a win every single time, is for people to be educated about the history and how far we've come in treatments. There's just still a lot of stigma, and I think that anytime you can educate yourself about something, it's the stigma lessens, because it's not just crazy people, it's people that are suffering from real mental defect, disease, just like people suffer from, physical defects and disease.
She says that being new to photography allows her to experiment with those concepts.
But I think that it makes me unafraid to really look at things from strange angles and be brave enough to have a very abstract, instead of taking a picture of a hallway up and down, to take a picture of the hallway sideways, because I can relate so much of that feeling off kilter to having mental health issues. How many times, people, especially, with anxiety, feel off kilter, anxious. So some of my photos are that way. Like when I look at them, I'm like, oh, it makes me a little uncomfortable. Well, yeah, basically that's when you're feeling anxious and you're trying to get through your workday, or you're trying to take care of your children or whatever, it's uncomfortable. And I think that in order to help other people understand or be able to sympathize and empathize with those of us who do struggle, that presenting them with some visual representation of what that feels like can really help them understand at least a little bit.
She looks for the scary stuff to capture your interest and get you hooked, kind of like we did in the last chapter.
A lot of the pictures that I've taken, especially obviously inside these buildings, are spooky and scary, and I hope that people see that, and I hope that they look at the pictures of, the doors to the cells and they're like, oh my God, this is terrible, because it is.
It's hard to think about things like mental health because it makes us feel vulnerable and connects with our own weaknesses. So sometimes we need a little push.
I hope that my photographs can jolt people into understanding that this is not just like a they problem or a them problem or of the other people problem, that this is a societal problem, this is a community problem.
She said that most of these problems are caused by resources. Even the hospital reports I read from 1940 say the same things over and over again. Overcrowding and poor living conditions can only be fixed with money. These systems just can't operate without resources.
And if we don't start to channel resources into really actually caring for people and helping the helpers, giving the helpers, those people who want to work with kids and families and prisoners and the difficult populations, if we don't start giving them the resources that they need in order to do the job that they need to do and that they want to do, then this problem will persist and it will continue to get worse, and our prisons will become more full. And we're paying for it in many, many, many ways, not just financially.
She wants to tell the real story of those problems through her art and her book.
Not just the ghost stories and the creepy stories, which are great, and I love all the creepy factors, but there was true suffering. There's, true progress made in the field of mental health there, and I think that those things are so important for us to continue to talk about.
When you seek out answers on your own to these stories, you can think about the problems that we have today. You can think about the needs of those suffering from mental health issues that are not getting the services that they need. After exploring the hospital, studying Jessica's art, and reading reports from the State Hospital Authority when Central State was open, I had a lot of questions. And it made me really interested in what happened after deinstitutionalization. Sometime in the 60s, there was a movement to close all the big state asylums across the country. John F. Kennedy signed a law saying that you couldn't incarcerate someone in a hospital just because they had a mental illness. It didn't happen all at once. It took lots of decades, and Central State didn't really close down until 2010, and there's still a building open and operating today. But back then in the reports, they called the patients inmates, so it was probably a good thing. Central State was constantly struggling to provide care for 12,000 patients with not nearly enough doctors and nurses. By the 50s, the ratio of staff to patients was 1 to 100. A really famous picture came out a while ago of a child locked in a metal cage, and you can see it in old newspapers. Jessica was a social worker for a long time, and those kinds of photos really caught her attention.
Most of my career I spent really focusing on children.
There were lots of kids who lived at Central State, far away from their parents and families. She found this one part of the hospital where they treated them. It was like a large doctor's office with a common room and kitchen, all the things that you needed for inpatient care.
There's a picture of a chair and some toys laying on the ground, like one of those plastic dump trucks, like a little blanket and stuff like that. And people a lot of times will ask me if I, added those things into the picture to make it spooky. And I don't add anything like that into any of my photos.
People don't want to think about kids with mental health issues or developmental disabilities because it's hard to think about. But they have to deal with these problems too.
A lot of people don't realize that very young children can have very severe behavior problems and mental health issues that families are ill-equipped to deal with in a home setting. And in the most severe cases, an inpatient type of situation is needed, but they're still children. And there's still toys, and there's still colorful murals in the building. That, to me, is heartbreaking.
And she thinks it's important for people to realize and acknowledge that these problems need to be solved, just like you go to a doctor when you get sick.
It's just like medical issues, like young children who have to battle cancer, when they're teeny tiny. We can't forget that mental health issues don't discriminate at all. It doesn't matter, just like cancer.
So what is the answer, and what happened to those adults and kids after there wasn't a place for them at Central State anymore? Some people lived their whole lives there, then found themselves shuffled off to community health homes and programs that replaced institutions. So what do people do now when they have a crisis?
Let's say that someone presents at the emergency room with suicidal or homicidal ideations, and they're suicidal or homicidal in that moment. It can't be the day before they were, but now they're feeling better. It has to be in that moment. Those people can be sent to an inpatient hospital. Normally, unless something's changed, people in this area would probably go to Augusta if they have a bed there, to then be stabilized on medication and then released. But if you don't have family or somewhere to go, is a revolving door. If you don't have a car to go get your medication, if you don't have insurance to help you pay for your medication, if you're so mentally ill that you're unable to hold a job, if you're unable to pay for housing, et cetera, it's a pretty desperate situation.
Most people just get sent home because there are very few beds left for long-term care, and most people are treated in an outpatient setting.
This is where a select few would be able to go into a community care home. So just a home in the community that is specific for those who have a severe mental illness and need continuous care. And they're, somewhat independent, but they can't live on their own. But most of the time, families have to do the best they can.
Inpatient care can cost hundreds of dollars a day, and insurance doesn't want to pay for it. For outpatient care, you only get so many days.
Which is not consistent and comprehensive care. It's put a Band-Aid on it and hope for the best. If they're not stable on medication and getting the appropriate behavioral interventions, they certainly cannot advocate for themselves at all.
And where do they go? So if they can't get the care that they need, or it isn't consistent and comprehensive, or they don't have a support structure, then what happens to them? I asked her. What are even the options now for people like that?
Jail.
In the 70s, Central State turned over 3 properties to be used by the Georgia State prison system. Those buildings that we explored, Rivers State Prison and Frank Scott Prison, but also another one called Men's Prison. I think they opened sometime in the 1980s. At some point, we started treating patients like prisoners.
I can really see the link between the mental health, those with mental health issues a lot of times ending up in our prison systems. In the Rivers building in particular, in the isolation segregation unit, the doors are incredibly heavy. They have the holes in them where the metal flat where it can be pulled down from the outside, and then, a tray be put in, or I assume that maybe inmates would have to be shackled before they could come out of the cell. And certainly if you commit a crime of seriousness, then you should be shackled and put into a locked cell. But it's also kind of heartbreaking as well to think of some of the prisoners, their crime is a direct reflection of their mental illness. And as someone who has dealt with severe depression and felt suicidal many times, to think about being in that space as then a prisoner, and then also dealing with the depression and, that kind of thing, it's incomprehensible to me.
There are an estimated 1 million individuals with mental illness that are homeless, incarcerated, or poorly housed. The tough on crime era of the 70s and 80s ballooned prison populations and led to what experts say is a coming crisis. It's estimated that 1/3 of the prison system will eventually be made up of geriatric patients that face mental health issues like dementia. The prisons are already full of people with mental health issues and substance abuse problems. Sarah was a substance abuse counselor in Rivers Prison and says that those things often go together because of things like self-medication. Some people believe that shutting down institutions like Central State led to this problem, but other people really aren't sure. In the next episode, we'll be exploring those issues and trying to figure out a way forward to take care of our most vulnerable people. We'll question whether a home like Central State is needed in the world today, or if community health is the answer. Jessica thinks that it might be a little bit of both. Stay tuned for the second episode of Lost Places and Faces. There will be plenty more spooky spaces in Central State to explore, and we'll be telling you the story of the prisons of Milledgeville. This is your host, Briarly Davis. Special thanks goes out to Jessica Whitehead for offering us this invaluable opportunity to explore Central State, and thanks to Matt and Sarah for keeping us safe along the way. If you'd like to know more about Jessica's art, you can check it out at seekingasylumphotography.com. Thanks to Tribe of Noise Pro and the artist Another Day for our intro and our outro, and Dieter Van de Westen and PNFA for setting the mood. Last but never least, thanks to you, the listener, for giving this first episode a chance. I hope you'll stick around to come on more adventures to explore with us. We'll take you to as many forgotten spaces that we can manage to get to without squeezing through the gate.